that child sex offenders are allowed to attend Mass.
Could you tell in terms of how did you brought that idea of keeping kids at the center, children at the center in the conversation, and how were you leading those conversations with stakeholders who might not be on board on day one?
Thanks, Dev. Well, I joined WA Police in 1986 at a time when policewomen did a very different role to the one they do today. As I always say, I graduated in high heel shoes. I wore a skirt, and they used to give us handbags, police issue handbags, that we had to carry everywhere we went. But the reality was that our role back then was to respond to the physical and sexual abuse of children and women. And 2% of the police service were women. 98% were men, but it was the policewoman's role to respond to those services. I share that because that's where a lot of my reactive and frontline experience with family and domestic violence and child abuse comes from. So I spent 30 years with WA Police, and then the Royal Commission started, and the Catholic Church was shaping up to be the single largest contributor to the abuse of children in Australia for the period of inquiry. And indeed, it went on to be the single largest contributor. And in 2014, the Archbishop approached me and said, we want to be part of the solution. We understand where we're at and we want to be part of the solution. And so then I went across and I was with the Archdiocese for 7 years as the Safeguarding Director. But this was in 2014. Nobody was talking about safeguarding. There actually in Western Australia was no safeguarding. And my role now presented that I had to start a safeguarding program. There was nothing to go with. There was nothing to build from. We had to create it. And in an organisation where hierarchy was front and centre. But that was okay. I came from an organisation where hierarchy was front and centre. I came from an organisation where it was male dominated. In the early days, we had to, as policewomen, do things twice as good to be considered half as good. So I was used to that. But we're coming into, in the diocese, it was very difficult because of, preconceived ideas. But the Archbishop at the time was very proactive. And most of the clergy were really good. Some weren't, but most were really good. Was it a difficult task? It was incredibly difficult. How are we going to make it happen? Through conversations. And that's what I found worked. Through conversations, sitting down and having conversations, explaining to people why we need to do this. So one of the areas that I found most difficult was, and you might be surprised to hear this, but child sex offenders are allowed to attend Mass. So there are a number of child sex offenders that may have gone into prison and come out, and they've been identified and they've been brought to my attention as the Director of Safeguarding. But it doesn't mean that they cannot attend Mass. They can attend Mass. But we have to put parameters in place. The safety of the children in the Mass has to have the priority. Well, that was one of the areas that I found most difficult. And obviously the clergy and a big part of the community found difficult for different reasons. But through conversations, telling them why we need to do this, telling them why we need to have church attendance agreements. So it wasn't the fact that they were coming to Mass, they were going to come to Mass. That was a given in the Catholic Church. It was about how do we create safety when they're attending Mass. And the congregation was on board with that. But many of the clergy didn't understand why we had to go to such extremes, so many measures that they had to sign off on when it came to a church attendance agreement. So they weren't really getting it. And that's where, again, I say the conversation, sitting down, having a conversation about it. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Dev, but I just want to give you an example. So I had a sex offender that was coming to Mass, and he wasn't happy that he had to be on a church attendance agreement. He wasn't allowed to stay behind for a cup of tea. He wasn't allowed to attend any of the fellowship events where children, or even if children weren't there, we said, no, you're not. You can attend Mass, but you can't attend any of the events because you're not coming through the back door on my watch. And that's the bit they used to struggle with. Then one of the priests supported that, but only until we had a really good conversation. So this gentleman said, I'm not going to sign that agreement. I should be allowed to come to Mass. I says, well, if you don't sign the agreement, you're not coming to Mass. And then he brought in his therapist. And his therapist said, I don't know why you're making him sign this. He hasn't offended for 12 years. And I said to his therapist, I says, well, can you sign a piece of paper? Can you give me a document that says he will not commit another offence? And the therapist went ashen and went, of course not. I'm not going to give you that. I can't tell you that. Exactly. Okay. And then we led into conversation again, and then he understood why he had to be on this agreement. And because of the conversation, he signed the piece of paper.